My younger sister handed me a glossy brochure and a $20,000 cashier's check, asking me to terminate my miracle pregnancy as a wedding gift. She looked me dead in the eye, stating that a pregnant bridesmaid would ruin her aesthetic, adding that I could always try more treatments later. She believed she was simply removing an inconvenience to secure her picture-perfect life. Little did she know that handing me that piece of paper would act as the catalyst to dismantle her fabricated world and strip away every cent our family possessed. My name is Audrey, and I am 33 years old. I am a forensic accountant specializing in locating hidden assets and exposing financial fraud. I am used to dealing with deception, but I never imagined I would find the most ruthless liars at my own family gatherings. The air inside the VIP fitting room of a luxury bridal boutique on Madison Avenue in New York City was heavy with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and an overwhelming sense of arrogance. I sat on a plush velvet sofa, resting my hands on my visibly rounded belly. I was 12 weeks pregnant. It was a pregnancy achieved after 3 grueling years of IVF, countless hormone injections, and the silent tears my husband, Logan, and I shared in private. My 26-year-old sister, Madison, stood on a pedestal before a floor-to-ceiling mirror. She was draped in custom-imported silk, adjusting a veil that cost more than my first car. She was the golden child, a lifestyle influencer whose existence was a carefully curated performance for social media. She had recently gotten engaged to Carter, a wealthy orthopedic surgeon from a prominent old money family in Greenwich, Connecticut. Madison stepped down from the pedestal, her heavy silk train dragging across the immaculate white carpet. She walked over to her designer handbag, pulled out a thick envelope, and dropped it into my lap. Inside was an elegant brochure for an exclusive private clinic on the Upper East Side. Tucked behind it was a cashier's check for $20,000 made out to my name. I stared at the numbers, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer audacity. I looked up at Madison, who was preoccupied with checking her profile in the mirror. "You need to book the appointment by Friday," she stated. Her tone was casual, as if she were asking me to pick up her dry cleaning. "I am not having a maternity dress in my bridal party, Audrey. It will completely ruin the aesthetic I'm going for. Besides, the photos will look ridiculous with you standing next to me looking bloated." I remained perfectly still. The profound cruelty of her words hung in the air. She was fully aware of the immense physical and emotional toll I had endured to get pregnant, the failed cycles, the heartbreak, the relentless medical bills. "Just take the 20 grand, Madison continued, turning to me with an exasperated sigh. "Use it to get the procedure done discreetly. Carter's family is very traditional, and I can't have them distracted by your drama. You and Logan make good money. You can always pay for another round of IVF next year. This is the only big day of my life, Audrey. Don't be selfish." A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. The hurt I usually felt regarding my family vanished, replaced by a calculating calm. I picked up the check, holding it up against the light of the chandelier. I smiled, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "You want to discuss paying for things, Madison?" I asked. I paid for my own IVF treatments out of pocket for 3 years, because our parents abruptly cut off my college fund during my senior year, claiming the business was struggling and they needed the cash. 2 weeks later, they magically found the money to buy you a brand new Range Rover just because you cried about having to take the subway. Her jaw tightened, the smug expression faltering for a fleeting second. "That is completely different, and you know it," she snapped, her voice rising an octave. "You're just jealous because Carter is giving me the life you always wanted. Now, are you going to take the check and fix this problem, or do I need to call Mom?" I leaned forward, sliding the check back across the glass coffee table until it stopped precisely at her feet. "Call her," I whispered. "But neither you nor she has enough money to buy my child, and you will both soon realize that I am no longer playing by your rules." The heavy velvet curtain separating our private suite from the main salon was violently yanked aside before the last word even left my mouth. My mother, Patricia, stood in the doorway holding a complimentary crystal flute of champagne, her knuckles white from gripping the stem. She wore a tailored tweed suit that projected an image of inherited wealth, though I knew it had been bought on a credit card with a 29% interest rate. She must have been standing right outside, listening to the entire conversation. Or maybe Madison had secretly texted her. "What on earth is going on here?" Patricia demanded. her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Before I could even attempt an explanation, Madison deployed her most potent weapon: tears. They fell instantly, rolling perfectly down her cheeks without smudging her expensive makeup. "Mom, Audrey is trying to sabotage my wedding," Madison sobbed, clutching the silk bodice of her dress. "She refuses to take care of her little problem. She's being completely unreasonable and selfish, as always." Patricia didn't ask for my side of the story. She never did. She marched across the plush white carpet, her designer heels sinking into the fabric with heavy, purposeful steps. Without a word of hesitation, without even a flicker of maternal concern, she raised her free hand and slapped me across my left cheek. The sharp, cracking sound echoed through the boutique's high ceilings, loud enough to elicit audible gasps from two bridal assistants arranging veils in the corner. They froze in shock, dropping the delicate fabrics to the floor. I didn't fall. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my hand to touch my stinging face. I simply turned my head back to look at my mother. "How dare you speak to your sister with such disrespect?" Patricia hissed, leaning in so close I could smell the gin beneath her expensive perfume. "You have always been a bitter, envious girl. You couldn't stand the fact that Madison is the one marrying into high society. You had to find a way to make this all about you." She took a deep breath, her chest heaving as she launched into the psychological manipulation that had defined my entire childhood. "Don't think I don't see exactly what you're doing, Audrey," she sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "You deliberately timed this pregnancy. You scheduled your little medical procedures to coincide exactly with her engagement just so you could steal her spotlight. You can't stand that Madison is securing a multi-million-dollar union with Carter's family, while you're just a miserable accountant married to a government employee. Carter's parents are Greenwich elite. They are respected, traditional, and flawless. We are not going to let your inflated ego and petty jealousy embarrass this family at the altar." The sheer delusion in her words was almost clinical. She was accusing me of enduring 3 years of agonizing fertility treatments, hundreds of painful injections, and endless heartbreak, all merely to upstage a wedding that had only been planned 6 months ago. As a forensic accountant, my entire career was built on separating emotion from facts. I looked at her and didn't see a mother defending her daughter. I saw a desperate, terrified woman, panicked at the possibility of losing her only ticket to wealth and social status. I saw a fraud. I slowly reached down and picked up the cashier's check that still lay next to Madison's bare feet. "Do you really think this is about jealousy, Mom?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. I held the crisp piece of paper between us, pinched the top edge, and deliberately tore it in half. Patricia gasped, her eyes widening in horror as I tore the $20,000 again and again, reducing the paper to useless shreds until it was nothing but confetti in my palm. I took a step forward, forcing my mother to take a step back. I held my hand over her crystal flute of champagne and opened my fingers. The shredded pieces of the check fluttered down, landing in her drink, turning the expensive champagne into a soggy, floating mess of ruined paper. "Keep your money, Patricia," I said, making sure to use her first name. "You are going to need every single cent of it very soon." I turned around, grabbed my coat and leather purse from the velvet chair, and walked straight toward the exit. I didn't look back at Madison, who was completely silent on her pedestal. I walked right past the two terrified bridal assistants, offering them a polite, tight-lipped smile. As I pushed through the velvet curtains and out the front doors of the boutique into the crisp New York air, the biting city wind hit my face, but it did nothing to cool the quiet fury burning in my chest. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket to order a rideshare. Before I could even open the app, the screen lit up with a rapid succession of text messages. The notifications exploded one after another, vibrating intensely against my palm. They were all from my father, Gregory. I stood on the edge of the bustling sidewalk, reading the barrage of texts. "Your mother just called me crying. What is wrong with you? You ruined your sister's dress fitting. You physically assaulted your mother and threw a drink on her. You are completely unhinged and out of control. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to apologize to both of them. You will do exactly what your sister asked of you, or you can consider yourself dead to this family. If you refuse, I am calling your building's management company tomorrow morning. I will remove my name from your lease as a guarantor and have you evicted by the end of the week." I will not subsidize the lifestyle of an envious, ungrateful brat. Do not test me, Audrey. I read the messages twice. A genuine, chilling smile spread across my face. The sheer arrogance of the man was almost comical, but his profound ignorance was what truly amused me. Gregory genuinely believed he still held the reins to my life. 5 years ago, when I moved into my luxury high-rise, my credit was still recovering from the substantial student loans I racked up after they cut off my college fund. Gregory had been a guarantor on the initial lease. He reveled in it, as it gave him a constant sense of control, a trump card he threatened to play whenever I strayed from his expectations. What my father conveniently forgot, or perhaps never bothered to notice because he was so consumed with funding Madison's luxurious lifestyle, was that I was a highly successful forensic accountant. My husband, Logan, and I hadn't been renting for a long time. We bought the entire penthouse outright 3 years ago. We removed Gregory's name from all financial documents the second the ink dried on the deed. He held absolutely no legal power to evict me from a property I owned free and clear. However, his threat sparked a wonderful idea. It reminded me of the leverage I actually had over him. Instead of typing an angry response to my father, I closed the thread and dialed another number. I contacted the managing director of my private real estate portfolio. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Good afternoon, Audrey," said my property manager, Mitchell. "How can I help you today?" "Hi, Mitchell," I replied, keeping my voice steady over the blaring horns of passing taxis. "I need you to pull the master file for the commercial property on Park Avenue. Specifically, the 5th-floor suite currently leased to Gregory's real estate firm." "Sure," Mitchell said. I could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard. "I have it right here. They leased the space under a corporate contract. I had purchased that commercial building 2 years prior through a shell holding company, purely as an investment when the previous owner declared bankruptcy. Gregory and Patricia had absolutely no idea that their scapegoat daughter was the mysterious corporate landlord to whom they had been writing rent checks for the past 24 months. "Tell me, Mitchell," I said, watching a black car pull up to the curb in front of me. "What is their current payment status?" Mitchell sighed. The sound of a man used to dealing with difficult tenants. "They are severely delinquent, Audrey. Their last 3 rent checks bounced, and the accounting department has been granting them grace periods because they promised a massive commission was coming in. They are currently 90 days past due." "Perfect," I whispered, opening my car door and sliding into the quiet leather interior. "I want you to draft a formal 30-day notice of eviction," I instructed, my voice devoid of any hesitation. "Print it and have it delivered by a registered courier directly to my father's receptionist tomorrow morning. I want it handed to him personally. No more grace periods, no extensions." "Are you absolutely sure?" Mitchell asked. "Commercial evictions can get pretty messy. I have never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied. "Serve the notice, Mitchell." I ended the call and leaned against the headrest as the car merged into the heavy city traffic. Gregory wanted to play games with housing and leverage. He wanted to threaten me with homelessness to force me to give up my unborn child. He was about to learn a very brutal lesson in what real power looked like. The war had officially begun, and my family had just foolishly handed me the launch codes. The black car pulled up in front of my building. I walked through the marble lobby, greeting the concierge, feeling a strange sense of calm. The elevator ride up to the penthouse was silent. Usually, stepping out to the panoramic view of the city skyline relaxed me, but today, my mind was making complex risk assessments. I needed to anticipate their next move. My phone began to ring, shattering the apartment's silence. The caller ID displayed Madison's name. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and answered on the 4th ring. "Audrey, please," Madison sobbed loudly into the receiver. The shift in her tone gave me emotional whiplash. The arrogant, demanding bride from the fitting room was gone, replaced by a trembling, fragile victim. Her acting skills were always her greatest asset. "Why are you doing this to me?" "I am so stressed about the wedding. My hair is falling out from anxiety. Carter is working crazy surgical shifts at the hospital, and I barely see him. I just wanted my older sister to support me, and instead, you attacked Mom and ruined my fitting. How could you be so cruel?" I took a slow sip of my water, letting her theatrical performance play out. I could almost hear Patricia coaching her in the background. "You handed me a brochure to terminate my child's life, Madison," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do not insult my intelligence by crying." I pressed the red button to end the call before she could squeeze out another fake tear or pivot to blaming me again. I placed the phone face down on the cold granite counter. 10 seconds later, it buzzed. I flipped it over. The victim act had evaporated as quickly as it appeared, replaced by raw, defensive venom. The text read, "Don't bother coming to the rehearsal dinner tonight. Carter's family has already been informed exactly what kind of woman you are. Save yourself the embarrassment and stay home." I stared at the glowing screen. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to look for patterns in erratic behavior. People committing fraud always panic when they lose control of the narrative. The message wasn't a warning, it was a barricade. She had launched a preemptive smear campaign. She needed to control the story before I could expose her true character to Carter's wealthy, dignified parents. If I stayed home, I would look guilty of whatever twisted lies she had just told them. By telling me not to come, she was proving she was terrified that my mere presence would dismantle her carefully constructed illusion. I walked straight into my walk-in closet. I wasn't going to hide in my apartment like a banished pariah. I was going to walk into that restaurant and let them look me dead in the eye. I bypassed the loose, flowing dresses I used to wear to hide my growing bump from my judgmental mother. Instead, I pulled out a tailored, emerald green maternity sheath dress. It was elegant, undeniably expensive, and hugged my 1-2 weak curve perfectly. It was the exact opposite of the bloated, shameful image Madison wanted me to project. I paired it with classic nude heels and a simple diamond tennis bracelet Logan had given me for our anniversary. I pinned my hair back into a sleek, polished chignon. I looked exactly like what I was, an independent, highly successful woman who could not be intimidated. I walked out into the living room just as Logan emerged from his home office, rubbing his tired eyes. He was deep into prepping a massive federal racketeering indictment and looked exhausted. "You look incredible," he said, pausing to admire my outfit. "Are we going somewhere?" "I'm going to the rehearsal dinner," I said, adjusting my watch. "Madison just informed me that Carter's family has been briefed on exactly what kind of woman I am. I figure it's only polite to introduce them to the real thing." Logan smirked. He knew my family's dynamics better than anyone, and he knew exactly what that cold, calculated look in my eyes meant. "Need backup?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "No," I replied, grabbing my leather clutch. "You need to finish your case. Besides, they aren't worth the time of an assistant U.S. attorney. This is just a preliminary audit." And it was just that, a preliminary audit. My goal was to collect data and observe their behavior. I took the elevator down to the garage and got into my car. The drive to the exclusive restaurant took 20 minutes. I handed my keys to the valet, smoothed the front of my emerald dress, and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the establishment. I was ready to face the firing squad, fully armed with the one thing my family never possessed, the truth. The maitre d' escorted me down a dimly lit dark oak paneled hallway. We reached the private dining room at the back of the restaurant. I paused for a fraction of a second outside the arched entrance, taking a deep breath before stepping into the lion's den. The room was stunning. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over a long mahogany table set with heavy silver cutlery and delicate fine china. At the far end of the table sat Carter's family. They were a portrait of dignified generational success. Carter's father, a retired chief of surgery, sat ramrod straight in a tailored charcoal suit. Next to him was Margaret, Carter's mother. She radiated a quiet, intimidating elegance in a structured plum dress, her posture perfectly erect. Next to Margaret sat Madison, and the sight of her almost made me laugh out loud. The girl who hours earlier had been screaming at me in a bridal boutique was now slumped in her chair, pressing a silk napkin to her chest and breathing in shallow, dramatic gasps. She was putting on an award-winning theatrical performance of severe morning sickness. "Oh, my dear," Margaret was saying, her voice tinged with genuine maternal concern as she gently rubbed Madison's back. "The first trimester is always the hardest. Let me have the waiter bring some ginger ale and saltines." Carter sat beside her, looking stressed but deeply devoted, as he poured her another glass of water. It was a perfectly executed manipulation. Madison was weaponizing a fake pregnancy to guarantee unconditional sympathy and loyalty from her future wealthy in-laws. I stepped forward, my emerald heels clicking softly on the polished hardwood floor. The sound was subtle, but in that quiet, intimate room, it was enough to draw attention. Madison looked up first. The fragile, sickly victim act vanished from her eyes for a split second, replaced by pure, absolute panic. Her sudden, rigid posture made Patricia turn her head. When my mother saw me standing there in my tailored maternity dress, looking confident and completely unfazed, all the color drained from her face. The clinking of silverware stopped abruptly. The low hum of polite conversation died instantly. The room fell into total silence. Patricia and Gregory reacted purely on instinct. They both shoved their chairs back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. They stood up in unison and rushed toward me before I could even reach the edge of the table. They positioned their bodies like bouncers, physically blocking my path to the rest of the guests. "What are you doing here?" Gregory hissed in a low voice, leaning in so close his expensive cologne was suffocating. "I told you not to come. Turn around and leave right now before I cause a scene. You have absolutely no right to show your face after what you did today. You are not going to ruin tonight for your sister," Patricia whispered frantically, her manicured fingers gripping my upper arm like a vice. "Get out." I looked down at my mother's hand digging into my arm, and then I looked dead into her eyes. "Let go of me, Patricia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but laced with enough ice to make her flinch and drop her hand. I was fully prepared to walk right around them, but I didn't have to. "Is everything all right over there?" A deep, commanding voice called out. It was Carter. He had stood up from his seat, a confused frown on his handsome face. He possessed the impeccable manners of an East Coast gentleman, and seeing his future in-laws aggressively corner a pregnant woman at the entrance of a dinner party clearly disturbed him. "Everything is fine, Carter," Gregory said quickly, forcing a loud, booming laugh that sounded completely artificial. "Audrey was just leaving. She isn't feeling well. Pregnancy fatigue, you know how it is." "Actually, I feel fantastic," I said, projecting my voice clearly across the room so Carter's parents could hear every word. "I wouldn't miss this dinner for the world." Madison looked like she was actually going to pass out. Carter immediately stepped out from behind the table and walked over to us. He completely ignored Gregory's frantic signaling. "Audrey, it's so wonderful to see you," Carter said warmly, leaning in to give me a gentle hug. "Madison mentioned you might not make it because of some family tension, but I am so glad you decided to come. Please, come sit. There's a spot right next to my mother." Carter offered his arm to escort me. I smiled sweetly, slipping my hand into the crook of his elbow. I could practically feel the heat radiating from Gregory and Patricia as they were forced to step aside and watch the man they were trying to impress treat me with the utmost respect. "Thank you, Carter," I said loudly. "I've been looking forward to properly meeting your parents all night." I let him guide me toward the table. As I took my seat next to Margaret, I caught Madison's eye. She was gripping her water glass so tightly her knuckles were white. Margaret watched me as I settled into my chair. Her dark, intelligent eyes scanned my face and then dropped to the emerald fabric over my belly. She offered a polite but incredibly measured smile. It was the look of a matriarch who had already been fed a venomous narrative and was deciding whether or not I was the villain she had been warned about. The real battle was about to begin, and I had just secured the best seat in the house. The first course arrived shortly after I sat down. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently around the mahogany table, placing delicate plates of seared scallops and crab tartare in front of each guest. The atmosphere was thick with a suffocating, unspoken tension. Carter's father raised his crystal glass to propose a warm, heartfelt toast to the happy couple and the merging of two wonderful families. I raised my sparkling water and smiled gracefully while I watched Gregory glaring daggers at me from across the table. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. Beside me, Madison barely touched her food. She kept her eyes glued to her plate, occasionally letting out a soft, dramatic sigh to remind everyone of her imaginary nausea. Margaret, however, was a masterclass in high society composure. She engaged me in polite, measured conversation as we ate. She asked about my career, her tone deceptively casual. I told her about my work as a forensic accountant, explaining how I specialized in tracing hidden assets and uncovering corporate fraud. I answered her questions with calm precision and articulate confidence. I saw a flicker of genuine surprise register in Margaret's dark eyes. I clearly didn't sound or behave like the erratic, unhinged woman she had been led to expect. As the waiters efficiently cleared the appetizer plates to make way for the main course, Margaret gently dabbed the corners of her mouth with her linen napkin and placed it carefully next to her plate. She turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Audrey, would you be so kind as to accompany me to the powder room?" She asked softly. It was perfectly polite, but we both knew it wasn't a request. It was a summons. I offered a warm nod, excused myself, and stood up. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Patricia grip the edge of the table, her face losing its color. Gregory looked like he was going to intervene, but stopping the groom's mother from going to the restroom would have been an inexplicable breach of etiquette. They were trapped, forced to sit there and watch us leave, knowing exactly what was about to happen. I followed Margaret down the dimly lit, oak-paneled hallway. We entered the women's lounge, a lavish expanse of imported marble, floor-to-ceiling mirrors, and gold fixtures. We were completely alone. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the restaurant. The moment the latch engaged, the warm, maternal smile Margaret had worn at the table vanished completely. It was replaced by the formidable, icy glare of a fiercely protective matriarch. She didn't raise her voice, but the sudden shift in her demeanor commanded absolute authority. "Audrey, I am a very direct woman, so I will get straight to the point," Margaret said, turning to face me head-on. "I have spent the last 3 days listening to your mother and your sister cry over the immense stress you are causing them. I was told that your presence here tonight is a calculated act of malice." I stood perfectly still, letting her speak. I needed to hear exactly what narrative Madison had spun. Margaret took a step closer, her voice dropping to a cold, disappointed register. "Madison confided in me about your unfortunate situation. She told me that your pregnancy is the result of a long-standing affair with a married senior partner at your accounting firm. She said you intentionally got pregnant to trap this wealthy man, and when he flat-out refused to leave his wife and family for you, you became incredibly bitter and vindictive. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Madison had taken the very real, painful struggle of my IVF journey and twisted it into a cheap, scandalous soap opera. She had weaponized my successful career to make the lie sound plausible. According to your sister," Margaret continued, her eyes locked on mine, "you are determined to ruin this wedding because you cannot stand to see her secure a respectable, loving marriage while you are embroiled in a shameful public scandal. Since you have no family of your own to fall back on, you are trying to destroy hers out of pure spite." I kept my expression entirely neutral, absorbing the heavy accusations without flinching. "Our family values integrity and character above all else," Margaret said, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Carter is a prominent surgeon. His reputation is spotless, and our family name carries significant weight in Greenwich. We absolutely cannot have a scandal like this attached to his wedding. We will not be dragged into your mess. For the sake of your sister, and more importantly, for the sake of my son, I am asking you to immediately step down as a bridesmaid. I want you to quietly excuse yourself from this dinner and stay far away from the wedding tomorrow." Margaret stood tall, waiting for me to crumble and confess or run out crying. She had delivered her ultimatum, completely unaware that she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle my sister's fake world. I didn't gasp, I didn't break down, nor did I rush to frantically defend my honor. As a forensic accountant, I knew the loudest person in the room was usually the guilty one. I simply looked at Margaret, recognizing the heavy burden she thought she was carrying to protect her son. It was almost sad how easily my sister had manipulated this incredibly intelligent woman. I slowly opened my leather clutch and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen, navigated into my secure personal files, and handed the device directly to Margaret. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her brow furrowing in confusion, before accepting the phone. On the screen was a high-resolution scan of a legal document issued by the state of New York. "That is my marriage certificate, Margaret," I said, my voice soft and perfectly steady. "I have been legally married for 4 years. The man I am supposedly having a scandalous affair with is my husband, Logan. He is 35 years old, and he is certainly not a senior partner at my accounting firm. Margaret stared at the screen. Her eyes scanned the official seals, the dates, and the signatures. I swiped the screen to the left, opening a photo gallery. There was a picture of Logan and me on our wedding day, followed by a recent photo of us at a charity gala. Logan looked sharp in his tuxedo, projecting an undeniable aura of authority and integrity. Logan is an assistant United States attorney, I explained, watching Margaret's expression begin to fracture. He is a federal prosecutor. The only reason he isn't sitting next to me at that dinner table tonight is because he is currently in his office preparing a massive federal indictment for a racketeering case. He sends his deepest apologies for missing the rehearsal dinner, but federal judges aren't particularly forgiving with strict legal deadlines. The silence in the luxurious powder room became absolute. I watched cognitive dissonance wash over Margaret's face. She was a highly educated, perceptive woman. She was mentally replaying the tearful, dramatic confession Madison had given her, comparing it against the irrefutable, undeniable proof resting in the palm of her hand. The realization hit her like a physical blow. My sister is an exceptional storyteller, I continued, keeping my tone entirely conversational. She knew I was coming tonight, and she knew I wasn't going to play along with whatever narrative my parents had constructed to secure this marriage. So, she preemptively created a scandal so vile, so offensive to your family's values, that you would demand I leave before I ever had the chance to speak to you. Margaret slowly lowered the phone. The icy, protective glare she had directed at me moments prior completely vanished. In its place was a look of profound shock that rapidly morphed into a quiet, terrifying rage. It wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the woman currently sitting next to her son in the dining room. She looked me in the eye and cried, Margaret whispered. Her voice strained with disbelief. She sat in my living room, drank my tea, and wept about how your actions were deeply hurting the family. She told me you were a homewrecker. People who are lying usually cry the loudest, Margaret, I replied gently. It's a distraction tactic. They rely on your empathy to override your logic. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I am an accountant. I deal strictly in documentation and facts. The fact is, I am a happily married woman carrying my husband's child, and your future daughter-in-law just fabricated a malicious, calculated lie to remove me from this room. I let those words hang in the air. The seed of distrust hadn't just been planted. It had been driven deep into the soil. If Madison was capable of lying so easily and convincingly about her own sister's pregnancy, what else was she lying about? I could see the exact moment that very question crossed Margaret's mind. Her eyes widened slightly, her posture stiffening as the implications began to spiral. Margaret handed me back my phone. Her hands were perfectly steady, but the energy radiating from her had completely shifted. She was no longer a mother trying to manage a petty family squabble. She was a matriarch who had just realized there was a predator in her house. I apologize for the accusation, Audrey, Margaret said, her tone entirely different now. It was respectful, cautious, and incredibly serious. You were manipulated, I corrected. And I don't blame you for trying to protect Carter. He seems like a genuinely good man. He deserves the truth. I smoothed the front of my emerald dress and picked up my clutch. Shall we return to the table? I believe the main course is about to be served, and I'd hate to keep my family waiting. Margaret and I walked out of the opulent powder room side by side. The shift in power dynamics was palpable. When we re-entered the private dining room, the suffocating tension from before seemed to have multiplied tenfold for my family. The main course had just been served plates of roast lamb and truffle risotto steaming in the dim light. Gregory and Patricia were practically vibrating with anxiety. They expected Margaret to return alone, or perhaps for me to run out of the restaurant in tears. Instead, we walked in together, heads held high. Margaret didn't even look at my mother. She glided back into her seat next to her husband with a terrifyingly calm expression. I walked back to my own chair, taking a slightly wider path around the table. As I approached my seat, I had to squeeze behind Madison's chair. She had carelessly tossed her massive designer handbag onto the empty chair beside her. The heavy leather bag had tipped over on its side, the gold clasp undone. Some of its contents had spilled out onto the dark upholstery, a compact mirror, an expensive tube of lipstick, and a glossy piece of black and white thermal paper. I glanced down casually, intending just to walk past, but my eyes locked onto the paper. It was an ultrasound photo. As a forensic accountant, my brain is hardwired to process visual data and recognize patterns in fractions of a second. I stopped walking. Something was fundamentally wrong with the image. I stared at the shape of the gestational sac printed on the glossy paper. It was distinct, slightly asymmetrical on the left side. But what made my blood run cold was the small, faded smudge in the top right corner of the black background. It was a printer defect. I knew it was a printer defect because I had spent hours staring at that exact same smudge on the 8-week ultrasound image currently pinned to my refrigerator at home. My mind raced, cross-referencing the details. The angle of the scan, the granular static near the bottom edge, the precise measurements logged in tiny text on the side. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. It was my scan. My private medical record from a month ago. How did she get it? Suddenly, I remembered posting a heavily cropped version in a private family group chat right after my appointment, before I realized just how toxic they truly were. I had cropped out my name, but the image itself was fully intact. Madison hadn't just lied about me having an affair. She was actively weaponizing the medical imaging of my unborn child to fake her own pregnancy to Carter and his family. The sheer depravity of the act was staggering, even for her. I needed proof. Without a second thought, I grabbed my phone, which was still in my hand from the conversation with Margaret. I made a show of stumbling slightly on the thick carpet, pretending to lose my balance. I dropped my leather clutch to the floor right next to Madison's chair. "Oh, excuse me," I muttered, bending down to retrieve it. As I crouched, my phone hovered just inches over the spilled contents of her bag. I tapped the screen, relying on the silent setting to mask the camera shutter. I snapped 3 high-resolution photos of the ultrasound image, making sure the lighting caught the details perfectly. The camera captured the image alongside the edge of her designer bag, tying the evidence directly to her. I slipped the phone into my pocket and grabbed my clutch from the floor. As soon as I stood up, Madison turned around. Her eyes darted from me to her tipped-over bag. Absolute panic flashed across her face. She lunged forward, practically climbing over her own chair, and snatched the ultrasound photo off the seat. She shoved it deep into the bag and snapped the gold clasp shut with a loud, aggressive click. "What are you doing snooping through my things?" she hissed in a low whisper, her eyes narrowing into venomous slits. I smoothed my emerald dress and looked down at her. Her face was flushed with anger and terror. She was gripping the straps of her bag so tightly her knuckles were white. "I was just picking up my clutch, Madison," I said calmly, taking my seat next to her. "You really should be more careful with your things. You never know what might leak out for the world to see." She glared at me, her chest heaving, but she couldn't say anything else without drawing the attention of Carter's parents. I picked up my fork and took a bite of my dinner. The food was absolutely incredible. The war was far from over, but I now possessed the nuclear launch codes securely stored in the digital camera roll of my phone. The rest of the rehearsal dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and tense silence. I ate my truffle risotto, offered my polite congratulations during the toasts, and left the restaurant the moment dessert was cleared. The drive back to the penthouse was completely silent. My mind was already leagues ahead, calculating variables and processing the magnitude of what I had just discovered. When I walked through the front door of my apartment, I didn't bother changing out of my emerald dress. I walked straight past the bedroom and down the hall to my home office. This room was my sanctuary. It was outfitted with 3 high-resolution monitors, encrypted hard drives, and enterprise-grade forensic software. My day job consisted of tearing apart manipulated balance sheets, detecting forged signatures on corporate contracts, and finding money that billionaires desperately wanted to keep hidden. Exposing a 6-year-old lifestyle influencer would be child's play. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, booted up my workstation, and connected my phone to the secure server. I transferred the 3 photographs I had secretly taken of the ultrasound in Madison's bag. I opened them in my forensic imaging suite, a program designed primarily for detecting pixel manipulation and digital tampering in financial documents. Next, I logged into my private hospital's patient portal and downloaded the original digital file of my own 8-week ultrasound scan. I dragged both images to the center monitor, placing them side by side. At first glance, to the untrained eye, they were just 2 grainy black and white medical images. But I didn't have an untrained eye. I began the digital verification process. First, I cropped the edges of Madison's photo, isolating just the ultrasound screen. Then, I overlaid my original hospital file directly on top of hers. I set the top layer to 50% opacity and slowly dragged it into alignment. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was an absolute, indisputable 100% match. Every single detail lined up perfectly. The slightly asymmetrical shape of the gestational sac, the pattern of granular static near the lower left quadrant, and there, at the exact same coordinate in the upper right corner, was the faded smudge from the hospital's defective printer. It was mathematically impossible for two different women to produce an identical sonogram down to the microscopic pixel grain. I brought the opacity back to 100% and zoomed in on the top margin of Madison's photo. This was where the patient data was printed. My name and medical ID number had been completely erased. In their place, typed in a crisp, slightly misaligned Arial font that did not match the hospital's dot matrix system, was the name Madison. She had literally photoshopped her own name over my medical records. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screens in the dark room. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, revealing a much darker picture than a simple case of sibling rivalry. Madison wasn't pregnant. The dramatic nausea at the dinner table, the act of rubbing her flat belly, the absolute refusal to drink champagne, it was all a meticulously choreographed performance. She was faking an entire pregnancy to trap Carter. She knew a man with his traditional family values and impeccable moral compass would never abandon a woman carrying his child. She was weaponizing a fabricated baby to secure her spot in high society and lock down a wealthy surgeon. But the realization brought a wave of chilling questions. If she was faking a pregnancy, why was she so desperate for me to terminate mine? Why had our parents gone to such aggressive lengths to force me out of the wedding and demand I get rid of my baby? A fake pregnancy would eventually be discovered, unless she planned to stage a tragic miscarriage right after the wedding. But my real pregnancy was somehow a direct threat to her entire scheme. There was a financial motive here, a massive one, and I could smell it like blood in the water. The door to my office opened silently. Logan stood in the doorway wearing sweatpants and a plain gray t-shirt, holding 2 mugs of tea. He looked at my face, illuminated by the monitors, and instantly knew something monumental had happened. He walked over, setting the mugs on the desk, and looked at the 2 screens. As a federal prosecutor, it took him only 5 seconds to process the side-by-side images and the glaring font discrepancy on the forged document. "Is this what I think it is?" Logan asked, his voice low and deadly serious. I nodded, keeping my eyes locked on the forged name. "My sister is completely faking her pregnancy. Logan, she stole my medical file to convince Carter to marry her." Logan crossed his arms, his prosecutor instincts activating instantly. "That's wire fraud, Audrey. If she's doing this to secure financial assets in a marriage, she is crossing a very dangerous legal line." "I know," I replied softly, "and my parents are helping her cover it up. Tomorrow morning, I am going to find out exactly why. They poked the wrong bear, and I am about to tear their entire financial history to shreds." It was shortly after 9 a.m. the next morning when the serene, quiet atmosphere of my accounting firm was violently disrupted. I was sitting at my sleek glass desk, reviewing a complex offshore tax audit when my office phone rang frantically. My assistant sounded panicked. She told me there was a very agitated man in the lobby demanding to see me, and he was refusing to leave. Before she could even finish her sentence, I heard muffled, angry shouting echoing through the heavy oak doors of my suite. I stood up, smoothed my tailored navy maternity blazer, and walked out into the reception area. Gregory stood in the middle of the immaculate marble lobby. His face was flushed a dangerous mottled shade of red. He was waving a thick stack of legal papers in the air, aggressively pointing his finger at our bewildered security guard. He looked entirely out of place among the quiet professionals walking the halls. I walked calmly toward him, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I instructed security to stand down and gestured for my father to step into my private office. I refused to let him turn my workplace into a stage for his theatrical tantrums. He brushed past me without a word, radiating furious, chaotic energy. The moment the heavy office door clicked shut behind us, Gregory completely exploded. He slammed the stack of papers onto my glass desk with such force my coffee cup rattled. It was the commercial eviction notice my property manager had delivered by registered courier earlier that morning. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Gregory screamed, a vein bulging in his neck. He began pacing back and forth across the Persian rug. "How dare you buy my office building behind my back? You are a vindictive, hateful daughter. You are trying to destroy your own family just because you are jealous of your sister. You think you can use your status as a corporate landlord to bully us into submission? You are going to call your management company right now and cancel this eviction, or I swear to God I will ruin you." I stood behind my desk and let him vent his rage. I watched him flail and shout, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. He expected me to cower, cry, or engage in a screaming match. When he finally ran out of breath, leaning heavily against the back of a guest chair and demanding my compliance, I simply sat down. I didn't raise my voice. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, pulled out a thick, black leather-bound ledger, and slid it directly across the glass surface toward him. "Open it, Gregory," I ordered, my tone stripped of any familial warmth. He hesitated, his arrogant glare faltering slightly before he grabbed the binder and flipped it open. Inside was a complete, unedited financial breakdown of his real estate firm. After discovering Madison's forged ultrasound the night before, I had stayed up late running a full forensic audit on his commercial accounts using public and corporate databases. "Let's drop the delusion that this is about a wedding rivalry," I said coldly. "Look at page 3. Those are the records of your last 3 consecutive rent checks. They all bounced for insufficient funds. Look at page 7. That is a detailed summary of the massive, crushing corporate debt your company is currently drowning in, including the high-interest predatory loans you took out just to maintain your fake upper-class lifestyle." Gregory's eyes darted rapidly across the spreadsheets. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The overbearing, booming patriarch from 2 minutes ago vanished instantly. "You aren't being evicted because I'm holding a grudge," I continued, leaning forward and resting my hands on the desk. "You are being evicted because you are a fundamentally incompetent businessman who hasn't paid rent in 90 days. You are a liability to my real estate portfolio. I own that building free and clear, and I don't subsidize bankrupt tenants." He swallowed hard, staring at the undeniable proof of his financial ruin. "Audrey, please," he started, his voice suddenly weak and trembling. "If you kick us out, the business will collapse completely. We have nowhere else to go." I ignored his pathetic shift in tone. "The 30-day notice was a standard professional courtesy," I stated, my voice like ice. "But after your unacceptable performance in my lobby this morning, that courtesy is officially revoked. You have exactly 48 hours to pack up your entire office and vacate the premises. If your firm is not completely moved out by Friday morning, I will personally call the marshals to have your assets seized and your employees forcibly escorted out of my building." Gregory stared at me. The icy finality in my voice seemed to finally pierce the thick layer of delusion he had lived in for decades. He looked from the open ledger on my desk to my face. Searching for a trace of the daughter who used to desperately seek his approval, he found nothing. I watched his entire physical posture collapse. His broad shoulders slumped, his aggressive chest caved in, and his hands began to shake. It was a spectacular, pathetic unraveling of a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of power. He sank into the guest chair, burying his face in his hands. The silence in the office was heavy, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. The tailored suit he wore suddenly looked too big for him, like a costume he had stolen. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and filled with genuine, absolute terror. "Audrey, please," he begged, his voice cracking. He sounded like a terrified child, not a titan of real estate. "You can't do this. You don't understand what's at stake here. The wedding tomorrow is the only thing keeping the creditors from tearing us apart. Carter's family is practically royalty in Greenwich. The moment Madison marries him, we secure a massive line of credit just by association. We can save the company." I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. "I don't care about your lines of credit, Gregory. I care about my property. You have 48 hours. He shook his head frantically, leaning so far forward he was practically laying on my glass desk. "It's not just the creditors," he hissed, desperation making him careless. The IRS is actively auditing our corporate accounts. We moved money, Audrey. We moved a lot of money we didn't actually have, hiding it in shell companies to keep up appearances. If this company goes under before the wedding, before the baby arrives, the federal government is going to indict your mother and me for tax evasion. I raised an eyebrow. Tax evasion is a serious federal crime, I said calmly. But that still doesn't explain why you came to my apartment and threatened to make me homeless just to force me to abort my child. Madison marrying a wealthy doctor doesn't magically erase federal tax fraud. Carter isn't going to write a check to the IRS for a family he barely knows. Gregory was completely spiraling now. The pressure of maintaining the lies had totally broken his cognitive filters. He gripped the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning white, his eyes wild and unblinking. "Don't you understand?" he cried, his voice strained and hoarse. "It's not about Carter's money. It's about the trust fund. If you ruin this wedding, if you have your baby first, we lose the trust completely. If Madison doesn't have the first baby, the money stays locked, and your mother and I are going to federal prison." The words hit the air like a physical shockwave. Gregory froze instantly. His eyes widened in pure horror as his own brain caught up to what his mouth had just said. He slapped a hand over his mouth, trying to physically shove the words back down, but it was too late. The damage was irreparably done. I sat perfectly still. My forensic mind instantly dissected the 3 crucial data points he had just handed me. The trust fund. The first baby. Federal prison. The puzzle pieces snapped together with violent, sickening clarity. The forged ultrasound I found in Madison's bag. The theatrical morning sickness. The unhinged demand for an abortion. It was never about bridesmaid dresses or aesthetic wedding photos. It was about a hidden pool of money that was somehow tied directly to the birth order of the next generation. My unborn child wasn't an inconvenience to their social climbing. My child was a catastrophic, direct financial threat to their survival. Gregory stood up awkwardly, stumbling backward away from my desk as if the glass surface had suddenly caught fire. "Audrey, I didn't mean that," he stammered, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Forget I said that. You're confused. I'm just stressed." I stood up slowly, picking up the heavy ledger and tossing it back into the bottom drawer. "I am not confused at all, Gregory," I said. "In fact, I've never seen things more clearly in my entire life." I walked around the desk and opened my office door, gesturing toward the reception area. "The 4 8-hour deadline stands. If you are not out of my building by Friday, you are going to have a lot more to worry about than a corporate eviction. Get out of my sight." He looked like he wanted to argue, to beg, to try and spin another frantic lie, but he looked at my face and realized he was completely out of ammunition. He turned and practically ran out of the office, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the marble lobby floor. I shut the heavy oak door and locked it. I walked back to my desk, my heart beating a slow, rhythmic drum of adrenaline. I sat down and pulled my keyboard toward me. I didn't know what trust fund he was talking about yet. I had never heard of any generational wealth in our family, but I was an expert at finding hidden money, and I was about to hunt down every single dime. The lock on my office door clicked, but the silence inside didn't bring me peace. It brought absolute, lethal focus. I returned to my desk, my mind racing with the 3 words my father had just handed me accidentally: the trust fund, the first baby, federal prison. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, cracked my knuckles, and booted up my 3-monitor workstation. My grandfather had passed away 12 years ago. As long as I could remember, Gregory complained bitterly that the old man had left him nothing but a struggling real estate firm and a mountain of unfulfilled expectations. Gregory always claimed the estate was totally bankrupt upon his death. It was the founding myth of our family's supposed financial hardships before Gregory miraculously turned the business around. Now I knew that was a blatant lie. I opened my firm's proprietary legal database, bypassing standard public records and accessing state and federal probate files directly. I ran a deep dive search on my grandfather's full legal name, cross-referencing it with my father's social security number and the business's tax ID numbers. For 10 minutes, the screen showed nothing but the publicly recorded transfer of the real estate business. But I am a forensic accountant. I know that people who want to hide money don't leave it in the front yard. They bury it under layers of complex legal entities. I shifted my parameters, searching for irrevocable family trusts established in the state of Delaware during the year of my grandfather's death. I filtered the results by naming conventions tied to our family's original properties. And there it was. A locked, highly restricted file designated as the Legacy Vanguard First Generation Irrevocable Trust. Because I was a direct blood descendant and held high-level legal clearance through my federal accounting firm, I was able to bypass the surface-level privacy locks and pull the unredacted formation document. I began reading through the dense 60-page legal manuscript. When I reached page 14, the entire sick conspiracy my family had built came into glaring focus. My grandfather wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what kind of man Gregory was. He knew his son was a reckless, arrogant spender who would squander any direct inheritance on luxury cars and country club memberships. So, my grandfather bypassed him completely. He took the bulk of his liquid wealth, placed it into a blind index fund, and sealed it legally. Over the last 12 years, that fund had quietly accrued interest in a booming stock market. The current valuation at the bottom of the ledger was a staggering $25 million, but it was the disbursement clause that made my blood run cold. The trust was legally designed to remain entirely frozen until one very specific condition was met. The entire fund becomes available, and the mother of the firstborn great-grandchild immediately receives full legal custody of the $25 million transfer. I reread that clause 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The mother of the firstborn great-grandchild becomes the sole trustee until the child reaches 21 years of age, giving her absolute authority to manage the funds for the child's welfare, housing, and lifestyle. It was a blank check. A $25 million blank check. I sat back, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark realization settling over me. Madison wasn't just faking a pregnancy to manipulate a wealthy surgeon into marrying her. Carter was the prize, yes. But he was also the perfect alibi. Madison needed a husband who could provide her with an immediate, unquestionable alibi for a sudden baby, perhaps through a quick private adoption or a paid international surrogate. They could later pass off as a miraculous premature birth. But there was a massive, insurmountable obstacle in her path. Me. I was 12 weeks pregnant. My baby was real. My baby was due in exactly 6 months. If I gave birth, the trust fund would execute automatically. I would instantly become the legal guardian of the $25 million, and Gregory wouldn't be able to touch a single cent to save his failing business or pay off the IRS. That was why they were so terrified. That was why they were willing to do anything, say anything, and destroy any boundary to force me into an abortion clinic. My real baby was a ticking time bomb threatening to go off before she could produce her fake baby and claim the trust money for our parents to steal. They were literally willing to kill my unborn child to save themselves from federal prison. A cold, terrifying calm washed over me. The shock evaporated, leaving only pure, weaponized clarity. I picked up my phone from the glass desk. I didn't need to confront my parents. I didn't need to scream at my sister. I needed to dismantle their entire operation from the inside out, piece by piece. And the first piece to pull was the honorable, innocent man they were using as a pawn. I found Carter's number in my contacts and hit call. The line rang 3 times before Carter answered. I could hear the faint, rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors and the low hum of a surgical ward in the background. He sounded exhausted but maintained his usual professional demeanor. "Audrey," he said, his voice registering mild surprise. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine, Carter," I replied, keeping my tone golden and entirely non-threatening. "I know you're probably in the middle of a shift, but I wanted to call and offer my sincere apologies for the tension at the rehearsal dinner last night. My family has a habit of making things incredibly complicated, and it was entirely unfair that you and your parents were dragged into our dysfunction." Carter let out a heavy sigh, the sound of a man carrying a burden he didn't fully understand. "I appreciate that, Audrey. My mother spoke to me after dinner. She was quite shaken up about the misunderstanding regarding your situation. I'm glad we cleared the air. I want our families to get along, especially now that we're both expecting." That was the perfect opening, I thought, leaning into my chair, staring at the glowing trust fund document still illuminating my monitors. "That's actually the other reason I called," I said, injecting just the right amount of sisterly concern into my voice. "Since Madison and I are pregnant at exactly the same time, I've been thinking a lot about our family medical history. There are a few genetic markers on my grandfather's side that my doctor is currently screening me for. I wanted to make sure Madison is doing the same. Genetic markers? Carter repeated, his protective instinct kicking in immediately. Madison never mentioned anything about a family history. What kind of markers? Nothing immediately life-threatening, but definitely things an OBGYN should be monitoring during the first trimester. I lied smoothly. I needed a plausible medical excuse to back him into a corner. I figured the easiest thing to do would be for me to transfer my files to her doctor, or at least have our doctors consult. We're sisters, after all. Who is her doctor? I can just have my clinic reach out to their office directly. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of the hospital seemed to fade away as Carter hesitated. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, tinged with an awkward embarrassment that a man in his distinguished position should never have to endure. I actually don't know her doctor's name, Audrey, Carter admitted quietly. I injected the right amount of shock into my voice. You don't know? Carter, you're her fiancé. You're the father. I know, he said quickly, sounding defensive and deeply tired. But Madison has been incredibly sensitive about the pregnancy. She claims she suffers from severe medical anxiety. Every time I offer to go with her to an appointment, she starts crying. She insists that having a surgeon in the room makes her feel scrutinized rather than supported. She says it needs to be her private space until the second trimester. The manipulation was almost masterful. Madison had found the one excuse that would force a caring, highly educated medical professional to back off. She had weaponized his respect for her mental well-being, and she refuses to show you the ultrasound I asked about, I said, gently guiding him toward the cliff edge. She brought one home yesterday. He answered, his voice sinking even lower. But when I asked to look closer at the gestational sac measurements, she snatched it away from me. She accused me of treating our baby like a clinical case instead of a miracle. We had a massive fight about it. I just don't want to stress her out, Audrey. Not in her first trimester. He sounded so profoundly troubled. He was a brilliant man whose logical mind was screaming that something was wrong, but whose emotional heart was being held captive by a pathological liar. I decided it was time to cut the strings. Carter, I said, my voice dropping its soft facade to become firm, clear, and commanding. You are an orthopedic surgeon. You spent over a decade in med school and residency. You understand how the human body works. You know standard medical protocols. You know what a healthy pregnancy looks like, and you know how patients behave. He didn't interrupt. He was listening intently. Do not let my family exploit your empathy, I continued. Step outside of your relationship for a moment and look at the situation purely as a medical professional. Does her behavior align with any legitimate medical reality you have ever encountered in your career? Trust your instincts as a doctor, Carter. Your intuition is telling you something is wrong for a reason. I didn't wait for his response. I offered a polite goodbye and ended the call. I placed my phone face down on the desk. The seed of doubt I had planted with his mother had now blossomed into a full-grown tree in Carter's mind. He was going to start looking for the medical inconsistencies, and once a doctor starts looking for a disease, they always find it. I stood up, turned off my monitors, and prepared for my next move. The bridal shower was tomorrow, and I had a very special gift to deliver. 2 days before the wedding, the sky over the city was a brilliant, cloudless blue, providing the perfect natural lighting for my sister's meticulously curated bridal shower. The event was held in the private glass conservatory of a high-end botanical garden. I hadn't received an invitation, of course, but I didn't need one. The location had been heavily promoted on Madison's social media for weeks. She was treating the shower less like a family gathering and more like a sponsored corporate event. I arrived an hour after it started, timing my entrance perfectly. I wore a tailored cream maternity dress that made my 1-2-week bump subtle but undeniably visible. I bypassed the confused event staff at the entrance and walked straight into the sun-drenched conservatory. The room was breathtaking, filled with cascading floral arrangements, crystal champagne towers, and about 50 wealthy women mingling to the sound of a live string quartet. It took exactly 12 seconds for my mother to spot me. Patricia was standing near a towering display of white orchids, chatting animatedly with a group of Carter's aunts. The moment her eyes met mine, her fake, radiant smile completely crumbled. She excused herself with a panicked flutter of her hands and marched across the marble floor to intercept me before I could reach the center of the room. "What on earth are you doing here?" Patricia hissed, grabbing my elbow and trying to drag me behind a large decorative pillar. "You were explicitly told to stay away. I will call security to physically remove you if you don't turn around right now." I calmly looked down at her hand gripping my arm and then met her gaze directly. "I highly doubt you want to cause a physical altercation in front of Carter's extended family, Patricia," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant, especially when I brought such a thoughtful gift for my sister. I lifted a medium-sized, flat rectangular box wrapped in expensive silver paper with a large silk bow. Patricia stared at the box, her eyes narrowing with intense suspicion. "Whatever you are planning, it isn't going to work," she whispered, her voice trembling with contained rage. "You are not going to ruin her day. I am just here to give her a present," I replied. "Now let go of my arm, or I am going to scream and tell everyone you are hurting my baby." Patricia recoiled as if I had burned her. She dropped her hand, her face flushing with terrified anger. She knew I had her completely trapped. She couldn't cause a scene without exposing the ugly cracks in our perfect family facade to the high society guests she so desperately wanted to impress. I smiled politely, stepped past her, and walked directly toward the front of the room. Madison was seated in a plush velvet chair designed to look like a throne, surrounded by a mountain of beautifully wrapped presents. She was laughing loudly for a photographer, playing the part of the radiant, flawless bride. When she saw me approaching, the laughter died in her throat. She froze, her eyes darting frantically toward our mother, who was trailing behind me looking completely powerless. "Audrey," Madison stammered, forcing a wide, painfully artificial smile as the photographer continued to snap pictures. "I didn't think you'd be able to make it. I wouldn't miss celebrating your pregnancy for the world," I said loudly, ensuring the women sitting nearby could hear me. "I brought something very special for the nursery." I extended the silver box toward her. Madison hesitated. She looked at the box as if it were a live explosive, but with dozens of eyes watching her, and Carter's mother, Margaret, sitting just a few feet away, she had absolutely no choice but to accept it. She placed the box on her lap and slowly pulled the silk ribbon. "Go ahead," I urged her, my tone dripping with sweet sisterly affection. "Open it." Madison tore the silver paper and lifted the lid of the box. Inside, resting on a bed of tissue paper, was a heavy, ornate silver picture frame. She picked it up and turned it over to look at the image inside. All the blood instantly drained from Madison's face. Her skin turned a sickly, pale gray. Inside the picture frame was a crystal-clear, high-resolution print of the forged ultrasound I had photographed in her bag. But I had made one crucial addition before printing it. In the bottom right corner of the glossy photo, I had half the hospital's original encrypted QR code completely intact and highly visible. I leaned forward, resting my hand gently on the arm of her velvet chair, and lowered my voice so only she could hear me. "If anyone scans that code with their phone," I whispered, "Madison, it links directly to my secure patient portal at the hospital. It will show my name, my patient ID, and the exact date I had that scan." Madison stopped breathing. Her hands began to shake so violently the silver frame rattled against the arm of the chair. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with pure, primal terror. The arrogant, smug influencer was completely gone. She realized in that exact moment that I knew absolutely everything, and that I held the power to destroy her entire life with a single barcode scan. "Oh my God," Madison gasped loudly, dropping the silver frame face down into her lap as if it were burning her skin. She clapped a hand over her mouth, stood up from the chair, and knocked over a tray of empty champagne flutes in her haste. Without another word, she shoved her way through the crowd of confused guests and bolted out of the conservatory toward the restrooms, leaving behind a room of stunned silence and a mother who looked like she was about to pass out. The sun had barely set over the New York skyline when the private elevator chimed in the foyer of my penthouse. I had instructed my concierge to let my parents up the moment they inevitably arrived. I knew the incident at the bridal shower would force their hand. They could no longer pretend I was just a jealous sister. They knew I possessed the medical proof of Madison's fraud. And judging by the panic they were about to bring into my home, they suspected I knew about the money too. I stood in the center of my living room, dressed in comfortable cashmere loungewear. Before the elevator doors even opened, I picked up my phone, opened my smart home security app, and ensured the high-definition cameras hidden in the corners of the ceiling were actively recording crystal-clear video and audio. Gregory and Patricia stepped into the foyer. They looked absolutely terrible. The polished, arrogant veneer they had worn my entire life was completely shattered. Gregory's tie was loosened, his face pale and haggard. Patricia looked like she had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Her eyes were red, and her hands shook as she clutched a thick leather folder. They didn't yell this time. They didn't threaten eviction or hurl insults. They walked into my living room with the grim, quiet demeanor of hostages walking to an execution. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the white leather sofa opposite the glass coffee table. They sat stiffly. Gregory placed the leather folder on the glass surface. He unzipped it and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents, sliding them toward me. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked like a man completely out of options. "The fight is over, Audrey," Gregory said, his voice hoarse and devoid of its usual booming authority. "You won. You figured it out. We know you looked up your grandfather's trust fund. We know you have the evidence to expose Madison. We are here to make a final business arrangement." I didn't touch the papers. "What kind of arrangement?" I asked intentionally, keeping my voice steady and loud enough for the overhead microphones to capture perfectly. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "We took out a massive loan against the last remaining equity in the company," she whispered frantically. "A private loan shark. It's incredibly dangerous. But it was the only way to get fast cash. We are prepared to offer you $250,000, wired directly to an offshore account of your choosing by tomorrow morning. $250,000. I repeated slowly, letting the number hang in the quiet room. "And what exactly are you buying with that money?" Gregory tapped the top of the legal contract. "A clean break. The contract stipulates that you will board a private flight to Geneva, Switzerland, tomorrow evening. We have already booked a discreet appointment at an elite private clinic. You will terminate the pregnancy. Furthermore, you will sign a legally binding waiver, permanently relinquishing your rights to the Legacy Vanguard Irrevocable Trust." The sheer depravity of the offer was breathtaking. They were sitting in my living room, casually offering me $250,000 of mob-borrowed money to murder my child so they could execute a $25 million heist. I needed to get the full confession on tape. I picked up the contract and flipped to the second page, pretending to consider it. "Let me make sure I understand the terms of this deal," I said, looking directly at my parents. "You want me to abort my baby? You want me to do this so Madison can continue to fake her pregnancy to Carter, pretend to give birth to the first great-grandchild, and claim the $25 million from Grandpa's trust fund. And you need her to do this because you committed federal tax evasion and will go to prison if you don't inject that trust money into your bankrupt real estate firm. Is that entirely correct?" The silence in the room was heavy. Gregory looked down at his hands, ashamed but completely unrepentant. "Yes," Gregory admitted, his voice a pathetic croak. "That is the reality of the situation. If you don't take this deal, Audrey, we lose everything. We go to federal prison. Your sister will be ruined. We are begging you. You can have another baby later. Just take the money and let us survive." Patricia started sobbing quietly, burying her face in her hands. "Please, Audrey, don't destroy your family." I let the camera record their fake, manipulative tears for 5 full seconds. Then, I tossed the contract back onto the glass table. The heavy thud made them both jump. "I am not taking your blood money," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "And I am not signing away a single right to my child's inheritance. You built a house of lies, and now it is burning to the ground." Gregory's face hardened. The desperation vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, cornered fury. "If you don't take this money," he hissed, "we will have security physically drag you away from that church. You will never get near Carter or his family." I stood up, crossing my arms over my chest. "I highly recommend you leave my home before my husband returns," I said coldly. They grabbed the contract and practically ran for the elevator. I watched the doors close behind them. I immediately picked up my phone and saved the video file to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. I had the entire conspiracy, the bribe, and the financial motives fully documented. The trap was set, and the wedding was in less than 48 hours. Before the polished brass doors of the private elevator could close completely, Gregory lunged forward and slammed his hand against the sensor. The doors jerked open again. He stepped halfway out of the elevator, his face a mask of wild, cornered desperation. "If you think you can just dismiss us and walk away, you are dead wrong," Gregory spat, his voice echoing in the marble foyer. "I am hiring private armed security for the church on Saturday. I will give them your photograph and strict orders to deny you entry. If you so much as step foot on the cathedral grounds, you will be arrested for trespassing. You are not going to ruin Madison. You are not going to take that trust fund from us." I didn't flinch. I took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between us until I was mere inches from his red, angry face. "I want you to look up, Gregory," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Look at the top right corner of the foyer ceiling. Then look at the corner above the living room window." Gregory blinked, his eyes darting upward. He spotted the small black lenses of the high-definition cameras, blinking with a faint red recording light. Patricia, standing behind him in the elevator cab, let out a sharp gasp and covered her mouth in absolute horror. "This entire penthouse is outfitted with a state-of-the-art security system," I explained, enunciating every word with lethal precision. "The recording is in glorious 4K resolution and crystal-clear audio, which means I now have a flawless digital file of you and Patricia sitting on my sofa, admitting to federal tax evasion and offering me $250,000 in illegal loans to force me to undergo medical procedures and commit a $25 million inheritance fraud." Gregory's jaw went completely slack. The color drained from his face so fast I thought his legs might give out beneath him. "I will be attending my sister's wedding on Saturday," I continued, my gaze locked on his terrified eyes. "I will walk through the front doors of that church and I will take a seat. If a single security guard tries to touch me, or if you attempt to bar my entry in any way, I will not call the local police. I will immediately hand this unedited video file over to my husband. Logan is an assistant U.S. attorney. Care to guess how fast a federal prosecutor can secure a racketeering and wire fraud indictment when he has a recorded confession from the prime suspects?" Gregory couldn't speak. He was totally paralyzed by the crushing weight of his own unbelievable arrogance. "If you want to spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary, Gregory, go ahead and tell your security guards to stop me. Otherwise, I'll see you at the ceremony." I reached out and pressed the lobby button on the elevator panel. Gregory stumbled back into the cab, his eyes wide with pure, hollow terror. The brass doors slid shut, sealing them inside, and the elevator hummed quietly as it descended. 20 minutes later, the front door unlocked and Logan walked in. He dropped his briefcase by the console table and loosened his tie, looking exhausted from his long day in federal court. His fatigue vanished the second he saw the expression on my face. "What happened?" Logan asked, his prosecutor instincts instantly going on high alert. I led him into my home office, sat him down in the leather chair, and played the security footage. Logan sat in absolute silence as he watched my parents offer me dirty money to end our unborn child's life. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped beneath his skin. When the video ended, the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Logan didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. His anger was far more dangerous than that. It was cold, calculating, and entirely focused on the absolute destruction of the people who had threatened his family. "They are going to try to stop you at the church anyway," Logan said, his voice hard and flat. "Men like your father don't surrender until they are completely out of oxygen. He will hire the guards, hoping my federal badge isn't enough to breach private property without a warrant. Then we make sure we don't need a warrant," I replied, pulling up a digital floor plan of the cathedral I had found online. We walk through the main entrance together. You flash your federal credentials. You tell the private security that interfering with a federal officer during an active investigation is a felony. They are getting paid $20 an hour. They aren't going to risk prison for Gregory. "We're going to need physical copies of everything," Logan said, opening his briefcase to pull out pristine legal folders. The forged ultrasound with the hospital QR code, the medical billing receipt for Madison's intrauterine device that you found in the audit, and a certified transcript of this bribery conversation. When we expose them at the altar, we don't just tell the crowd. We hand the undeniable evidence directly to Carter in front of his entire family. We leave absolutely no room for your sister to cry and spin another lie. For the next 3 hours, we sat side by side in the glow of the monitors. We printed the high-resolution documents, placed them into heavy stock presentation folders, and orchestrated a flawless, airtight execution plan. We timed exactly when to enter the sanctuary for maximum impact. We anticipated every countermeasure Gregory might attempt and neutralized it legally. My family had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence and my resolve. On Saturday, they would learn exactly why you never go to war with a forensic accountant. Saturday arrived with crisp, brilliant weather. The wedding was held in an opulent cathedral in the heart of Manhattan. It was a $1 million production designed to broadcast an image of generational wealth. Half a block away, I could see the cascading arches of white roses framing the heavy oak doors and the line of luxury vehicles idling at the curb. It was a glittering stage set for a play that was about to be canceled. I sat in the back of our hired town car, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I had chosen a floor-length, deep sapphire blue gown. It was elegant, commanding, and draped perfectly over my 1-2-week bump. I didn't look like the discarded pariah my family painted me to be. Beside me, Logan looked formidable in a tailored charcoal suit, his federal badge clipped securely inside his breast pocket next to the presentation folders containing our explosive evidence. The car pulled up to the curb. Logan stepped out first, offering his hand. As we walked up the wide stone steps toward the main entrance, the scale of my father's paranoia became visible. Gregory hadn't just hired a standard event coordinator. He had hired an armed private security firm. Standing in front of the massive carved wooden doors were 2 imposing men in sharp black suits, complete with earpieces and visible holsters under their jackets. As we reached the top of the stairs, one man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small laminated card. I could clearly see my own face printed on it, a photo from my corporate profile. Gregory had given them a blacklist. The guard stepped directly into my path, holding up a hand in a firm stop gesture. "Excuse me, ma'am," the guard said, his voice flat. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back. You are not on the approved guest list for this event." I stood my ground. "I am the bride's sister," I said politely. The guard glanced at the photo on his card. "I am aware of who you are. I have direct orders from the father of the bride that you are explicitly barred from entry. If you attempt to pass through these doors, we are authorized to physically remove you and contact local law enforcement. Please return to your vehicle." He crossed his arms, widening his stance to block the entrance. The second guard stepped up beside him, silently reinforcing the barricade. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. Logan stepped forward smoothly, placing himself between me and the 2 guards. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at them with the cold, evaluating stare of a man who puts dangerous criminals in federal prison for a living. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his leather credential wallet. He flipped it open, revealing the heavy gold shield of the Department of Justice and his federal ID card. He held it right in front of the lead guard's face. "My name is Logan, and I am an assistant United States attorney," my husband said, his voice carrying lethal authority. "The woman you are threatening is my wife. More importantly, she is a key witness in an active federal investigation regarding wire fraud and tax evasion directly involving the man who hired you today." The guard's posture stiffened instantly. His eyes darted from the gold federal shield to Logan's unblinking stare. "We are walking into this building," Logan continued, putting his badge away. "If you lay a single finger on my wife, or if you attempt to impede our entry, I will place you under immediate federal arrest for obstruction of a federal officer and witness tampering. I highly doubt Gregory is paying you enough to risk a mandatory minimum sentence." The silence that followed was absolute. The guard looked at his partner. They both did the math in their heads. A private security contract was not worth a federal indictment. The lead guard cleared his throat, suddenly looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Understood, sir," the guard muttered, taking a large step backward and lowering his hands. "We don't want any trouble with the feds." They opened the heavy oak doors, completely clearing our path. Logan offered his arm. I slid my hand through his, keeping my head held high as we walked past the neutralized blockade. We stepped out of the sunlight and into the cool vestibule of the cathedral. The distant chords of the organ echoed through the stone hallways. The bridal march was about to begin, and the bride had no idea her worst nightmare had just walked through the front door. Logan and I stepped into the cavernous rear of the cathedral just as the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind us. The thick oak sealed us inside, instantly muffling the distant sirens and city traffic. The scale of the event was staggering. Towering stone arches reached toward a vaulted ceiling, and every available pillar was wrapped in thousands of imported white roses and lush greenery. The wooden pews were packed with over 300 guests. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lilies and expensive designer perfumes. We stood in the deep shadow of the back row, perfectly concealed from the family seated at the front of the sanctuary. At the altar stood Carter. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but his physical posture lacked the relaxed, radiant joy of a man about to marry the love of his life. His broad shoulders were stiff, his eyes darting slightly, scanning the room with the sharp, unsettled focus of a surgeon trying to diagnose a complex internal problem. My phone call had worked perfectly. He was no longer a blind, devoted groom awaiting his bride. He was a man actively looking for the disease I had warned him about. The string quartet swelled into a sweeping classical piece, signaling the arrival of the bride. The entire crowd stood up in unison. Madison appeared at the top of the aisle, escorted by Gregory. She wore a custom silk gown that must have cost a small fortune, its heavy train gliding effortlessly over the white carpet. She looked absolutely triumphant. She smiled radiantly, playing the part of the glowing, pregnant bride with sickening perfection. Beside her, Gregory walked with his chest puffed out, practically vibrating with arrogant victory. He never once looked back at the entrance to check the doors. He blindly assumed his hired guards had done their job and kept his nightmare fully neutralized outside. When they reached the altar, Gregory handed Madison off to Carter. I watched Carter's face with forensic precision. He didn't smile broadly. He accepted her hand with a polite, measured nod, his jaw tight. In the front row on the groom's side, Margaret sat perfectly straight. Her hands were clasped firmly in her lap. She was watching Madison with the cold, calculating eyes of a matriarch who knew a storm was coming but didn't yet know the exact direction of the wind. The minister, a tall, imposing man in flowing white robes, stepped up to the wooden pulpit and raised his hands to quiet the murmuring crowd. The ceremony officially began. He spoke eloquently about love, unwavering devotion, and the beautiful merging of two prominent families. He spoke about the future, about building a lasting foundation of truth and mutual respect. The bitter irony of his words echoed loudly off the stone walls. I stood perfectly still next to Logan, gripping the heavy presentation folders containing the exact evidence that would burn that very foundation to ash in a matter of minutes. The ceremony progressed with a tense, suffocating rhythm. Madison recited her vows with a soft, heavily rehearsed voice. She made a point to occasionally press a delicate hand to her flat stomach for dramatic maternal effect. It was a performance designed for an audience. Carter delivered his vows respectfully, but his voice lacked the deep emotional resonance of a man making a genuine lifelong commitment. The tension in the cathedral was thick and palpable, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable fracture. Then, the minister reached the traditional, historically ignored portion of the ceremony. He closed his leather-bound book and looked out over the sea of well-dressed, wealthy guests. He took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch for a long, heavy moment before uttering the words that had been explicitly written into the script of my revenge. If anyone can show just cause why this couple may not lawfully be joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The minister paused. In a normal wedding, it was a mere formality, a brief 2-second silence before the joyful exchange of rings. But this was not a normal wedding, and my family was entirely abnormal. Logan stepped aside, clearing my path. I walked out of the deep shadow at the back of the sanctuary and stepped firmly into the center of the white-carpeted aisle. The sound of my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor sounded like gunshots in the dead silent church. I didn't raise my hand like a child asking for permission. I didn't scream hysterically, nor did I cry. I projected my voice with the clear, unyielding authority of a woman who held absolute, undeniable power over the room. I object, I said. My voice echoed off the high stone walls, cutting violently through the heavy air and reaching every ear in the building. Hundreds of heads snapped around to look at me simultaneously. The collective gasp that rippled through the crowd was loud and genuine, a sharp intake of breath from 300 wealthy socialites who had never witnessed a real objection in their lives. At the altar, Madison froze completely. Her perfectly practiced smile shattered instantly into a mask of pure, absolute terror. I took another purposeful step forward, gripping the legal folders tightly at my side. I object, I repeated, ensuring there was absolutely no confusion about why I was standing there, on the grounds of medical and financial fraud. The word fraud hung in the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral, like a physical weight. For 3 agonizing seconds, the sanctuary was so quiet I could hear the rustle of silk from the bridesmaids' dresses. Then, the dam broke. Patricia let out a sharp, hysterical shriek from the front pew. It wasn't a gasp of surprise. It was a raw, absolute scream. She jumped to her feet, dropping her expensive Chanel purse onto the stone floor, her face contorting into a mask of pure panic. The sudden noise ignited the crowd. 300 wealthy guests erupted into a chaotic symphony of loud gasps, frantic whispers, and shifting bodies. On the groom's side of the church, the dignified composure of Carter's family instantly morphed into rigid shock. Margaret sat bolt upright, her dark eyes locked onto me with a fierce, calculating intensity. She remembered our conversation in the restaurant powder room. She knew exactly what was happening. At the altar, Madison looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her hands flew to her mouth, her bouquet of white roses dropping to the carpeted floor. Carter immediately took a large step away from her. He didn't look angry yet. He looked like a surgeon who had just cracked open a chest cavity and found something totally unexpected and catastrophic. "Stop her," Gregory roared. My father's voice thundered over the rising chaos of the congregation. He was standing near the front pew, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of my presence, when his brain finally registered that his multi-million-dollar heist was collapsing in front of 300 people. His survival instinct overrode any sense of social decorum. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He shoved past a groomsman and practically sprinted down the center aisle toward me. He was a big man fueled by pure, cornered adrenaline. His heavy footsteps pounded aggressively on the white runner. His hands were curled into tight fists, and his eyes were wild with violent desperation. He fully intended to grab me by the arms and physically drag me out of the sanctuary before I could say another word. "You ungrateful brat," Gregory spat as he closed the distance between us, his voice dripping with venom. "I will kill you. I will literally kill you." He lunged forward, reaching his large hands out to grab the fabric of my sapphire dress, but he never made contact. Logan moved with the fluid, calculated speed of a man who faced cartel bosses and corrupt politicians. He stepped smoothly in front of me, shielding my body with his own. As Gregory reached forward, Logan shot his hand out and grabbed my father's right wrist in midair. With a swift, practiced motion, Logan twisted Gregory's arm downward and pinned it tightly against my father's own chest, locking his shoulder into a painful, completely immobilized position. Gregory let out a sharp grunt of pain, his forward momentum stopping immediately. He struggled blindly for a second, but Logan planted his feet and maintained the joint lock with unbreakable force. Logan leaned in, but projected his voice so it carried clearly over the frantic murmurs of the crowd. "If you take one more aggressive step toward my wife, I will place you under federal arrest right here on this carpet," Logan said, his tone absolutely lethal and entirely devoid of emotion. Assaulting a federal prosecutor and a key witness to a financial crime carries a mandatory prison sentence. You're already looking at a decade for your tax evasion, Gregory. Do you really want to add violent assault to your federal indictment? The word hit Gregory like a bucket of ice water. The wild, violent rage in his eyes extinguished instantly, replaced by the crushing realization of being totally outmatched. He was no longer bullying his teenage daughter in the privacy of their suburban home. He was standing in a crowded cathedral, physically restrained by a federal officer who held his entire life in the palm of his hand. "Let me go," Gregory whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of pain and profound humiliation. Logan held the lock for one more agonizing second, ensuring the lesson was permanently seared into his mind. Then, With a look of pure disgust, Logan released his grip and shoved Gregory backward. Gregory stumbled, his expensive suit jacket riding up his shoulders, looking pathetic as he caught his balance against a wooden pew. Logan adjusted his tie, kicked the fallen program out of the way, and stepped aside to clear the path for me once again. He offered a slight, reassuring nod. I didn't give my father another glance. I walked right around his trembling form and continued my march down the center aisle. The cathedral had once again fallen into a deadly, suffocating silence. The guests were totally spellbound, watching me glide in my sapphire gown, my heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. I walked past rows of open mouths and wide eyes. Carter's wealthy family watched with a mixture of horror and deep respect, acknowledging the undeniable power of a woman who refused to be silenced. I reached the front of the sanctuary and stopped at the edge of the altar steps, directly in front of the minister, who was clutching his Bible like it was a shield. I looked at Carter, who was staring at me with desperate, questioning intensity. Then, I turned my eyes to Madison. She was shaking violently, her face slick with cold sweat. Her perfect day had officially become a crime scene, and I held all the evidence. The minister took a hasty step backward, practically merging with the stone wall behind the altar, wanting no part of the impending explosion. I stood inches away from the man who was supposed to become my brother-in-law. Carter looked at me, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between my calm expression and the heavy folders in my hands. I shifted my gaze to my sister. It looked like all the blood had been drained from her body. Her hands were trembling so violently the lace of her veil shook against her shoulders. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to spin another desperate lie, but her vocal cords completely seized. Trapped in front of 300 people, she knew I held the exact weapon that would destroy her life. I turned my attention back to the groom. I didn't address the crowd. I spoke directly to him, my voice projecting with the clear, unyielding tone of a professional auditor presenting undeniable facts. I told you on the phone to trust your medical instincts, Carter, I said. You are a brilliant orthopedic surgeon. You spent over a decade training to analyze the human body and read complex diagnostic imaging. You know exactly what a healthy pregnancy looks like, and you know what a forgery looks like. I want you to examine this. I opened the thick presentation folder and pulled out the 2 high-resolution prints Logan and I had prepared the night before. I held them out. Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with a mix of dread and desperate curiosity. Then, the surgeon in him took over. He reached out and took the papers from my hand. The first page is the official medical record of my 8-week ultrasound, I explained, pointing to the document on the left. You'll notice the hospital logo, my full legal name, my patient ID number, and the encrypted QR code at the bottom. The second page is the exact ultrasound photo your bride brought home to you 3 days ago, claiming it was a picture of your unborn child. Carter held the 2 glossy pages side by side. I watched his eyes scan the images. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. As a medical professional, he didn't need me to explain the nuances of the imaging. His brain automatically registered the visual data. He saw the identical, slightly asymmetrical shape of the gestational sac. He saw the exact same patterns of granular static near the bottom edges, and then his eyes locked onto the top right corner. He saw the faded smudge from my hospital's defective printer. It was perfectly replicated on Madison's supposed original scan. Look at the patient data at the top of her scan. Carter, I instructed softly. Notice how my name and medical ID were digitally erased. Notice how her name is typed in a crisp Arial font that doesn't match the dot matrix text generated by standard hospital ultrasound equipment. It's not just a similar scan, it's a pixel-by-pixel match. She stole my medical file from a family group chat and literally photoshopped her own name over it. Carter's hands began to shake. The heavy paper trembled in his grip. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The morning sickness, the refusal to let him attend appointments, the tears over medical anxiety. It was all a meticulously choreographed stage play. There was no baby. There never was. Carter, don't look at that! Madison suddenly screamed. Her voice cracked, the sound shattering the silence of the sanctuary. Her survival instinct finally kicked in, manifesting as pure, unhinged denial. She's lying! She hacked my phone. She fabricated those photos because she wants to ruin us. You know how jealous she is. Please, Carter, you have to believe me. She lunged forward, desperately reaching out her manicured hands to snatch the papers away from him. But Carter didn't let her take them. He took an aggressive, sharp step backward, pulling the evidence out of her reach. He looked up from the forged ultrasound and stared at the woman he was about to marry. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was absolute, profound revulsion. It was the look of a man staring at a total stranger. You used a fake pregnancy to trap me, Carter whispered. His voice was incredibly low, but the acoustics of the cathedral carried the raw devastation in his tone to the front pews. No, Madison sobbed, reaching out for his arm. I swear I'm pregnant. I am. Carter looked down at her hands, gripping the sleeve of his tuxedo. He physically recoiled, ripping his arm out of her grasp as if her touch were toxic. He dropped the 2 ultrasound prints. The glossy papers fluttered through the air, landing face up on the immaculate white carpet between them, the undeniable proof of her betrayal lying at her feet. He glared at her, his chest heaving as the illusion of his perfect bride unraveled. Madison stared at the 2 glossy papers on the white carpet as if they were venomous snakes. When Carter stepped away from her, the last thread of her sanity snapped. She let out a guttural, desperate sob and collapsed to her knees, clutching the heavy silk of his tuxedo pants. You have to listen to me, Madison wailed, the sound echoing painfully through the silent cathedral. Her perfect bridal makeup was completely ruined. Dark streaks of mascara ran down her flushed cheeks. She hacked my phone, Carter. She's a forensic accountant. She knows how to manipulate digital files and plant evidence. She stole my passwords and created those fake documents to frame me. She's been jealous of me her whole life and just wants to destroy my happiness because her own marriage is miserable. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice hitting a high, hysterical pitch. Look at her. Look at how smug she is. She's a sociopath. I am carrying your child, Carter. You know I am. I've been sick every morning. I've been picking out names with your mother. You can't let her poison our family with her lies. Carter stood paralyzed, staring down at the woman clinging to his legs. A tiny, dangerous sliver of doubt flickered in his eyes. He was a man of science, but he was also a man who desperately wanted to believe in the goodness of the woman he loved. Psychological manipulation is a powerful tool, and Madison was a master craftsman. She was weaving a narrative of victimhood so intense, so emotionally charged, that it threatened to override the clinical evidence he had just seen. From the front pew, Patricia suddenly chimed in, attempting to reinforce the lie. She's telling the truth, Carter, my mother cried out, clutching her chest. Audrey has been threatening us all week. She is deeply unwell. I watched Carter waver for a fraction of a second, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I didn't raise my voice to shout over their theatrical sobbing. I reached into the heavy stock presentation folder one last time. Logan stepped a little closer, a moving wall of support as I prepared the coup de grace. Tell me, if I hacked your phone to fabricate an ultrasound, Madison, I said, my voice slicing through the hysteria like a scalpel, then I suppose I must have also hacked our parents' joint bank accounts and fabricated their medical billing statements. Madison stopped crying instantly. Her mouth fell open. Her eyes locked onto the new sheet of paper I was pulling from the folder. The fake tears vanished, replaced by genuine, absolute dread. When our father barged into my office and inadvertently confessed to his financial crimes, I decided to run a full audit on the family's accounts. I explained to Carter, keeping my tone conversational. People who commit massive fraud often hide their tracks on the big purchases, but they are almost always careless with small, automated subscriptions and digital billing statements. I subpoenaed the family's data using my firm's legal clearance and cross-referenced it with their shared credit card statements. I held up the crisp white paper. It was a certified financial ledger, heavily highlighted in yellow ink. This is a billing receipt from your private gynecologist's office dated exactly 2 months ago, I stated clearly, ensuring the acoustics of the sanctuary carried every syllable to the crowd. It was charged to the family credit card and synced directly to your digital wallet. I took 2 steps forward and handed the paper directly to Carter. He took it, his eyes scanning the highlighted lines with brutal efficiency. As a surgeon, you are fully aware of what a paragard is, I said, watching Carter's face turn to absolute stone. It is a copper intrauterine device. According to this billing statement, Madison had it surgically inserted exactly 8 weeks ago, right around the time she supposedly conceived this miracle baby. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. The air felt heavy, completely devoid of oxygen. Carter stared at the medical billing code printed on the paper. The realization hit him with physical force. The entire elaborate charade crumbled to dust. "You cannot get pregnant with an IUD, Madison," I said, delivering the final, fatal blow to her illusion. "You just needed to trap him before I gave birth." Madison collapsed onto the floor, the heavy layers of her custom silk gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She didn't try to argue. She didn't try to scream that the document was fake. The sheer, terrifying precision of the medical receipt stripped her of her ability to lie. She sat on the cathedral floor, staring blankly ahead, completely destroyed by the undeniable truth. Carter slowly lowered the paper. The last remnants of his conflicted sympathy vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow realization. He had been targeted. He had been hunted by a family of financial predators who viewed his medical degree and wealthy background as nothing more than a lifeboat to save themselves from ruin. He looked down at Madison, who was now weeping silently into her hands. The disgust radiating from him was palpable. The wedding was officially over, the trap was broken, and the entire congregation sat in stunned, breathless silence as the golden child faced the final, inescapable consequence of her greed. The silence in the cathedral was suffocating. Carter took another heavy step back from Madison, who was now reduced to a sobbing heap of white silk on the altar steps. I could see the burning questions forming in the eyes of the guests. Why would a wealthy, beautiful woman go to such psychotic lengths to trap a man she was already engaged to? Why forge medical documents and fake a pregnancy when a lavish wedding was already planned and paid for? I turned away from my sister and faced the congregation. It was time to pull back the final curtain. I looked directly at Margaret, who was sitting rigidly in the front pew, and then swept my gaze across the sea of wealthy friends, country club associates, and business partners. My sister did not orchestrate this elaborate charade simply because she was desperate for a husband, I announced, my voice carrying clearly to the very last row of the sanctuary. Carter is a wonderful, honorable man, but to this family, he was nothing more than a highly respectable alibi. This entire wedding was the foundation of a calculated, multi-million-dollar financial heist. Gasps rippled through the wooden pews. Gregory let out a strangled, panicked noise from the sidelines and took a half-step forward. But Logan immediately shifted his weight, squaring his shoulders, and my father froze instantly, absolutely terrified of the federal prosecutor standing guard. I smoothed the fabric of my sapphire dress and continued. My grandfather died 12 years ago, leaving behind a locked, irrevocable trust fund currently valued at over $25 million, I explained, watching the eyes of the wealthy guests widen in surprise at the staggering sum. But my grandfather knew exactly how reckless and corrupt his son was. He knew Gregory would squander every penny, so he locked the money away with a very specific, ironclad legal provision. The trust, and the full custody of the $25 million, is immediately and solely vested in the mother of his firstborn great-grandchild. I gently placed my hand on my belly. I am 12 weeks pregnant. My child will be the firstborn, which means I am the sole legal guardian of that entire inheritance. My parents' real estate firm is completely bankrupt. They have been bouncing rent checks for months. They are drowning in predatory loans, and they are currently under active federal investigation for tax evasion. They are facing imminent prison time. They desperately needed that $25 million to save themselves, but they couldn't touch a single cent of it as long as my child existed. The collective horror of the crowd was palpable. I watched the faces of my parents' wealthy peers contort in absolute disgust. They needed Madison to have her first child to unlock the vault, I said, pointing at my weeping sister. But she wasn't pregnant, so they engineered a synthetic pregnancy, using a wealthy doctor as an undeniable cover, likely intending to use a secret international surrogate or fake a miraculous premature birth later to grab the cash. But first, they had to eliminate my child to clear the path. Patricia suddenly stood up from the front pew. She was shaking violently, her hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture of denial. "Do not listen to Hare," my mother screamed, her voice trembling under the crushing weight of imminent social collapse. She is crazy. She is making all of this up. We would never do something like that. We are a respectable family. I didn't argue with her. I didn't need to. I pulled my phone from my purse and walked over to the wooden pulpit where the minister had stood moments prior. I placed the phone directly in front of the microphone. I unlocked the screen, tapped the audio file I had transferred from my penthouse security system 2 days earlier, and hit play. The crystal-clear, high-quality audio of my parents' voices echoed from the cathedral speakers. The congregation listened as Gregory desperately admitted to tax evasion and the looming federal indictment. They heard Patricia sob as she offered me $250,000 in illegal loans. And then, the most terrifying sentence echoed through the high stone walls. They heard Gregory explicitly instruct me to board a private flight to Switzerland, terminate my pregnancy, and sign away my legal rights to the $25 million trust fund so they could avoid federal prison. The recording stopped. The click of the audio ending sounded exactly like a judge slamming down a heavy wooden gavel. The devastation was absolute and irreversible. The flawless, wealthy facade my parents had spent 30 years building was instantly annihilated in front of their entire social circle. The wealthy peers they had tried so desperately to impress were now looking at them not just as financial fraudsters, but as monsters willing to buy the abortion of their own grandchild to cover up a crime. Patricia covered her face with her hands, letting out a miserable, guttural sob, while Gregory stared blankly at the floor. His entire empire reduced to ashes in front of 300 horrified witnesses. The echo of the audio recording faded into the high vaulted ceilings of the cathedral, but the absolute horror of the words remained suspended in the air. Carter stood at the altar, his broad shoulders trembling. He was a doctor who had taken an oath to preserve human life, and he had just listened to the parents of the woman he loved casually negotiate the termination of their own grandchild to secure a massive financial payout. The pure, unfathomable evil of the conspiracy hit him. He slowly turned his head away from the stunned congregation and looked down at the floor. Madison was completely unraveled. She was sobbing hysterically, her hands clutching the edges of her custom silk dress, rocking back and forth on the white carpet. The flawless Vogue aesthetic she had obsessed over for months was totally ruined. Dark streaks of mascara stained her face, and her carefully styled hair was plastered to her cheeks with cold sweat. She looked up at Carter, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the polished leather of his shoe. "Carter, please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper through her tears. "I love you. We can still fix this. We can just walk away." Carter looked down at her, and the final remaining fragment of his broken heart turned to pure, impenetrable ice. He didn't see a terrified bride. He saw a predator who had targeted his medical credentials and his family's spotless reputation to build an alibi for a multi-million-dollar federal crime. He slowly took a step back, pulling his foot out of her reach. "You don't love me, Madison," Carter said, his voice dropping to a register so cold and low it sent shivers through the guests in the front rows. "You don't even know what love is. You needed a wealthy surgeon to validate a fake pregnancy, and you were perfectly willing to let your parents murder your unborn niece or nephew to get your hands on that money. You sicken me." He lifted his gaze from her sobbing form and looked directly at Gregory and Patricia. My mother was still covering her face, weeping into her hands, but Gregory was staring back at Carter with the hollow, empty expression of a man who knew his life was officially over. "You are a disgusting excuse for a father," Carter said, his voice echoing clearly through the silent sanctuary. "You sold your own daughter to a hitman in a medical clinic for a payout. You belong in a federal prison, and I hope they throw away the key." Gregory opened his mouth, perhaps to offer one last pathetic lie, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Logan, the federal prosecutor standing stoically in the aisle, and quickly looked down at the floor, completely defeated. Carter reached up to the lapel of his tailored black tuxedo. With precise, deliberate movements, he unpinned the white rose boutonniere that perfectly matched Madison's bridal bouquet. He pulled the pin out and held the delicate flower in his hand for a split second. Then, without breaking eye contact with the woman weeping on the floor, he opened his fingers. The white rose dropped, landing softly on the edge of Madison's expensive lace veil. It was the final, undeniable symbol of finality. The wedding was dead. Carter turned his back on the altar. He didn't wait for the minister to speak. He walked down the 3 marble steps, his posture perfectly straight, radiating the quiet, formidable dignity he had inherited from his parents. He bypassed my parents completely and walked straight to the first pew on the left side of the aisle. He stopped in front of his mother. Margaret was already standing. Her dark eyes were filled with a fierce, protective pride for her son. Carter reached out and gently took his mother's hands in his own. "I am so very sorry, Mom," Carter said, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "I am sorry I brought these people into our lives, and I am sorry I brought this humiliation upon our family." Margaret squeezed his hands firmly. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for, Carter," she said, her voice clear and commanding. "You are a good man who was deceived by wicked people. We are leaving now." Margaret released his hands and turned to her husband. Carter's father offered a sharp, authoritative nod. The silent signal rippled backward through the pews. What happened next was the most powerful display of collective self-respect I have ever witnessed. The entire groom's side of the church moved as one. Dozens of highly educated, wealthy guests stood up in perfect, unified synchronicity. There was no shouting, no dramatic insults hurled across the aisle. There was only the rustle of expensive fabrics and the sharp clicks of leather shoes turning toward the exit in silence. Carter offered me his arm as he passed. I smiled softly, declining the gesture, motioning for him to stay with his mother. He nodded, a look of profound gratitude passing between us. He walked down the center aisle, flanked by his parents, leading his family out of the toxic wreckage. The bride's side of the church remained seated, totally paralyzed by the magnitude of the scandal. They sat in suffocating silence, forced to watch the groom's entire family walk out the heavy oak doors, taking all the dignity, respect, and social status with them. Madison's wails echoed off the stone walls, but no one rushed to comfort her. My parents were left in the ruins of their shattered empire, totally abandoned, drowning in absolute humiliation. As the reality of their impending federal indictment finally settled over them, the heavy oak doors of the cathedral clicked shut behind the last departing member of Carter's family. But the mass exodus didn't stop there. The bride's side of the church, filled with country club associates and high society business partners of my parents, followed suit immediately. There were no polite goodbyes or sympathetic hugs offered to the family at the altar. The wealthy guests grabbed their expensive coats and designer bags in a rushed, awkward silence. They kept their heads down, actively avoiding eye contact with my mother, who was still weeping loudly in the front pew. Within minutes, the massive million-dollar production was entirely abandoned. The only people left in the cavernous, flower-filled sanctuary were me, Logan, my sister sobbing on the floor, and my parents. The sudden emptiness of the church seemed to strip away the last remnants of Gregory's self-preservation. Without the watchful eyes of his wealthy peers to keep his temper in check, his initial shock rapidly mutated into violent, unhinged rage. He turned away from the exit and locked his bloodshot eyes on me. "You destroyed us," Gregory bellowed, his voice echoing fiercely through the high stone arches. He stomped toward me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He stopped a few feet away, practically vibrating with fury. "You malicious, vindictive little girl. You just cost this family everything. Carter is gone. The trust fund is gone. We are going to lose the house, the cars, the business. You ruined our lives because you couldn't stand to see your sister succeed." Patricia stood up awkwardly, clutching her pearl necklace. She joined the attack, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You are an absolute monster, Audrey. How could you do this to your own blood? We gave you life. We raised you, and you orchestrated the complete destruction of your own family in front of the entire city." I stood perfectly still, letting their toxic accusations wash over me. I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. I looked at the three of them, a broken, pathetic portrait of greed and deception. "I didn't ruin your lives," I said, my voice slicing through their hysterical shouting with absolute, icy precision. "I didn't force you to bounce rent checks. I didn't force you to take predatory loans from dangerous loan sharks. I certainly didn't force Madison to steal my medical records and fake a pregnancy. You made every single one of those decisions entirely on your own. You dug your own graves, and you expected me to jump into the dirt and bury my unborn child just to cover it up. I simply refused to be your collateral damage." Gregory bared his teeth, stepping dangerously close. "You think you're so smart?" he hissed. spitting the words at me. You think you won? You have no idea what you just unleashed. Without that trust, without that money, the creditors are going to tear us apart. The company will be bankrupt by the end of the month. I looked at him and offered a slow, cold smile. It won't take until the end of the month, Gregory. I reached into the leather briefcase Logan was holding and pulled out a thick red legal folder. It was the final piece of documentation we had prepared. I held it out toward my father. He stared at it, his eyes narrowing with a fresh wave of panic, but he refused to take it. I let it drop. It landed on the white carpet right next to Madison's discarded bridal bouquet. That is a copy of the federal audit that has been secretly conducted on your real estate firm over the last 6 months, I explained calmly. While I was doing my own forensic analysis of your accounts this week, I passed my findings directly to my husband. Logan submitted them to the Financial Crimes Division. Your fraudulent shell companies, the hidden offshore accounts, the forged tax returns, it is all documented right there in that red folder. Gregory stared at the folder as if it were an active, explosive device. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving under his expensive jacket. Logan's office is seizing your company's assets on Monday morning for tax evasion, I stated, delivering the final, inescapable blow. Every single bank account tied to your name is being legally frozen. The doors to your office building, the commercial property that I own outright, will be padlocked by federal agents before you even wake up. You will not have access to a single penny. You ruined your own lives, Gregory. I just expedited the paperwork. Patricia let out a blood-curdling scream, collapsing back into the wooden pew. Madison wailed louder, curling into a fetal position on the altar steps. Gregory fell to his knees, totally paralyzed by his own destruction. I didn't stay to watch them mourn their empire of lies. I slipped my hand through Logan's arm. We turned our backs on the screaming, miserable remnants of my family. We walked down the long, white-carpeted aisle together, our footsteps steady and echoing with the sound of pure, absolute victory. The dark, suffocating grip they had held over my life was finally broken. We pushed through the heavy oak doors of the cathedral and stepped out into the crisp, brilliant sunlight, leaving the darkness completely behind. 6 months passed since the heavy oak doors of the cathedral closed behind me, sealing away the toxic chapter of my past forever. I sat in a comfortable rocking chair in the sun-drenched nursery of our penthouse, looking down at the sleeping baby in my arms. My son was absolutely perfect. He was healthy, peaceful, and totally oblivious to the massive storm he had inadvertently caused before he even took his first breath. Logan walked into the room, handing me a warm cup of tea and gently kissing the top of my head. The quiet peace in our home was a stark, beautiful contrast to the absolute destruction that had occurred outside our walls. My phone buzzed silently on the side table. It was a text message from my probate attorney. I had spoken with him earlier that morning to finalize the last piece of paperwork regarding my grandfather's estate. The text contained a single, highly anticipated sentence. The legal transfer is complete. The moment my son was born and his birth certificate was filed in the state of Delaware, the Legacy Vanguard Irrevocable Trust was officially unlocked. I was now the sole legal guardian and trustee of a $25 million estate. The money was securely transferred into heavily protected accounts, totally untouchable by the people who had desperately tried to steal it. During my call with the attorney, he gave me a brief, highly satisfying update on the legal proceedings surrounding my estranged family. The federal audit I had handed over completely dismantled my father's fraudulent empire. Within 48 hours of the ruined wedding, federal agents had padlocked the doors of his commercial office building. The government seized all of his corporate assets, freezing his bank accounts and liquidating his properties to pay off his massive tax debts. Their sprawling suburban mansion was foreclosed on by the bank a month later. Gregory and Patricia were currently living in a cheap, run-down roadside motel on the outskirts of New York. They were strictly barred from leaving the state by a federal judge while they awaited their criminal trial for tax evasion and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. They were facing up to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of the wealthy facade they valued more than their own daughter. And then there was Madison. Her perfect, highly curated life had violently collapsed. Carter had cut off all contact immediately, leaving her with the massive cancellation bills for a $1 million wedding reception that never happened. When rumors of her fake pregnancy and forged medical documents leaked into her elite social circles, she became an instant pariah. The wealthy friends she had spent years trying to impress blocked her phone number completely. Brands canceled her social media sponsorships overnight, not wanting to be associated with a clinically diagnosed fraud drowning in massive credit card debt, with parents completely unable to bail her out. The golden child was forced to face harsh reality. My attorney casually mentioned that a junior associate at his firm had recently spotted Madison working a minimum wage retail job at a discount department store in the suburbs. She spent her days folding the exact same designer brands she used to boast about owning, completely ostracized from the high society she had sacrificed everything to join. Carter, on the other hand, handled the fallout with the utmost class. A week after my son's birth, a gorgeous bouquet of blue hydrangeas arrived at our penthouse with a handwritten card from him and his mother, Margaret. They warmly congratulated us on the birth of our healthy baby and wished us a lifetime of happiness. They had moved on with their dignity fully intact. I rocked my chair gently, listening to my newborn son's soft breathing. My entire life, my family tried to convince me that I was the problem. They painted me as the bitter, envious outcast, while building their grand illusions of wealth and superiority on a foundation of lies. But standing firm in reality was all it took to bring their delusions crashing down. I didn't have to scream, scheme, or seek violent revenge. I just had to step into the light and let their own deception catch fire. True power doesn't come from manipulating others. It comes from living authentically and refusing to be a pawn in someone else's toxic game. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace, let me know how you found your strength in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving family betrayal. Remember, sometimes the greatest and sweetest revenge is simply living a beautiful, honest life completely out of their reach. Audrey's harrowing story serves as a powerful masterclass in how to navigate extreme emotional and financial manipulation. Among the many lessons of her journey, the most profound is that truth is the ultimate equalizer against toxic psychological manipulation. Dysfunctional families thrive in the shadows of deception. They rely heavily on guilt, theatrical emotional outbursts, and twisted narratives to maintain absolute control over their chosen scapegoats. In this story, Audrey's parents and sister expected her to crumble under the weight of their cruel demands, hoping she would react with vulnerable hysteria or blind submission. Instead, she taught us the unparalleled strength of clinical detachment. When dealing with pathological liars and manipulators, you do not need to scream to be heard, nor do you need to match their chaotic, venomous energy to win the battle. By treating their emotional warfare like a forensic audit, Audrey demonstrated that undeniable facts do not care about family ties. Faced with irrefutable evidence like a forged ultrasound, medical billing receipts, and audio recordings of their bribery, the abuser's entire empire of lies simply collapsed under its own weight. This narrative reminds us that protecting your peace often means taking a step back, removing your emotions from the equation, and letting the reality of an abuser's own actions destroy their false narratives. You are never legally or morally obligated to protect the dark secrets of people who are actively trying to destroy your life, even if those people share your DNA. True power lies in holding your ground and letting the naked truth fight for you. If you are currently navigating a toxic relationship, take a moment today to set a firm boundary and begin documenting your truth before they try to rewrite it. Audrey's harrowing saga offers a masterclass in surviving extreme emotional and financial manipulation. Among the many lessons of her journey, the most profound is the absolute power of objective detachment in the face of emotional terrorism. Toxic individuals thrive in the murky waters of psychological manipulation and fabricated hysteria. In the story, Audrey's parents and sister relied on guilt, theatrical meltdowns, and social pressure to steal a $25 million trust fund. They expected Audrey to react emotionally, to cry, scream, or desperately defend herself against their absurd accusations. Manipulators count on these reactive, defensive emotions to maintain control, exhaust their victims, and muddy the truth. Audrey, however, refused to play their game. Instead of fighting feelings with feelings, she fought lies with forensic evidence. By taking a step back and treating her family's deception as a clinical audit, she completely neutralized their power. She used digital files, medical receipts, and audio recordings to dismantle a house of cards that emotions alone could never knock down. This approach teaches us that when confronting pathological liars, your greatest armor is documentation and calm, unflinching resolve. The truth, backed by receipts and undeniable facts, is a fortress that abusers cannot breach. You do not need to convince toxic people of their wrongs, nor do you need to match their venomous energy. You simply need to expose the objective reality to the light and let the architecture of their lies crumble under its own weight. Audrey's triumph proves that protecting your peace often means stepping away and letting the perpetrator's own actions orchestrate their downfall. If you are currently navigating a toxic relationship, start documenting your truth today. Set an unbreakable boundary and refuse to let anyone else's manufactured chaos dictate your reality.